Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Outback Eats. Today is a long anticipated day you've all been waiting for. It's Brisket 101 Day. Joe, I'm excited to teach you guys a little bit about briskets for dummies. Or, I don't want to knock anybody down, but maybe briskets for beginners.
I'm a dummy when it comes to brisket. You could say brisket for dummies.
Briskets for beginners. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not a professional, but I have cooked a lot of briskets in my day. I want to start by throwing out a little chesty. I got my t-shirt on under here. What does it say there, Joe? It's the Wyoming State Championships barbecue competition. Hey, I got the t-shirt. I've been there, done that. Actually,
there's something else on your shirt too, isn't there?
I got the opportunity, Joe, to judge this contest. So, just want to show you here, I got my official barbecue judge certificate, my pin, wear that with pride. This is the only time you're going to see it from me. I've cooked a few briskets in my day. I've messed up a lot of briskets in my day, I can tell you that. So, what I want to go over today is Brisket Basics. Well, what is a brisket? How do we choose one? How do we prep it? How do we cook it? How do we trim it? How do we eat it? All those basics. How do we burn it? Because I've done that many times. What I want you guys to come away with at the end of this video is to not be intimidated by the high-class cut of beef we call brisket. It's everybody's favorite, but it can be a little tricky. But at the end of the day, it can be rather simple. And I'm just going to give you a few tips today. Hopefully when we're done here, you're all going to run out, buy yourself a brisket, and have a good time in your backyard. First things first, Joe, we need to learn what a brisket is. Where does it come from? How do we choose one?
Comes from the supermarket, right?
Yeah, it comes from the supermarket. So for starters, it comes from a rancher to begin with. And a brisket is a cut of beef. To dive into that just a little bit deeper, Joe, we're going to take a field trip. We're going to go find our local butcher and ask them a few questions about brisket. All right, guys, we made it to the famous Haxton Locker Plant today. We're going to go in here and talk with our friends Trevor and Roxanne Fix about a little bit about their shop, what they do here, and hopefully get some questions answered about what a brisket is. Hey, howdy. This is Trevor and Tim calling it Briskets for Dummies today. So just for somebody that hasn't cooked a brisket, maybe never even bought one, what is a brisket? Where does it come from? What type of choices do they have when they go to the store? What's a whole brisket? What's a flat brisket? All those kind of things.
Okay. It comes off of a beef.
Yeah.
I can show you where it comes from if you want to see that.
That'd be awesome. We're into everything.
Yeah. How's it going, man?
Good.
Here you got a half a beef. Basically, you got your 4 ribs. So about right in there would be your brisket. That's the front quarter of the beef. As far as I tell,
the pectoral muscle right here, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And this part down in here would be your point. This part right in here would be your flat.
Okay.
To tell what grade, they grade your beef by the eye, the rib loin eye.
Okay.
It's about the marbling in the eye itself. Like this one don't have.
This is where all the grading comes from.
Yeah. This I would probably be a select.
A select. Okay.
Probably a mid to a low select, I would say.
So
there's not a lot of marbling in there.
As far as the grading scale, tell me the grade. You say select, where does that come?
Select is your lower cut. Choice is your mid-range cut, which would have a lot more marbling in it. And your prime, it would be a lot of marbling in there.
Now, I'm talking marbling, just speckling right through here.
Yeah, speckling through it.
Okay. We're going to come get more lessons from you. This is good. If I go to the store somewhere and I'm looking for a brisket, I see Angus, different Wagyu. What kind of varieties or species do you see in here? Breeds? Do you see differences in breeds? Should I be looking for something special?
Mostly in here we get Angus, Charolais. There's not a lot of Herefords anymore.
Yeah.
We had a few Wagyus, but mostly it's Charolais and Black Angus or Red Angus.
I'm going to be cooking a Hereford today, but I have to ask for it.
Right.
It's not special, but
once in a while I'll get some box meat in and it'll be a Hereford or an Angus.
So what's so special about a Wagyu? That's kind of the end thing for high-end brisket. Is there going to be much different? Tam, you got any thoughts on it?
Not really, just a really marbled piece of meat.
Yeah. I appreciate your time, guys.
You're welcome.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
See you, Tim. So we'll be back for more questions. It's fun. Thanks, Trevor and Roxanne and Tim. Those were awesome basics about what a brisket is, where it comes from. Trevor talked just a little bit about the grading of a brisket. Today we are going to be using a Hereford brisket. This is just something that I have access to. What we're using today is a whole brisket. It basically has, this is the entire brisket that Trevor showed us. It's got the flat part here, and then it's got a nose. Oftentimes what you're going to find in your local store is this nose is going to be trimmed off. They call that a nose because actually the grains of the meat run in a different direction. The whole entire thing here is called a fat cap, but there's going to be a lot more fat here in the nose. A lot of this fat you can trim off if you don't want so much. We want to leave about 1/4 of an inch all the way across. The ideal thing is that this fat is going to render out or melt down into the beef. The brisket is part of the pectoral muscle on a steer or a heifer or a cow. That muscle gets used a lot. Brisket can be tough to cook because it has all that tough fiber muscle in there. The good thing about that is it's going to cause us to cook low and slow, which is going to allow all that fat, tough fibers to melt and encapsulate throughout the rest of the piece of meat. It's going to make it a great, tasty product if we do it right. It's not that tough to do. There is a little, because we're cooking it slow and slow, we've got a little bit more grace. We just kind of need to manage it and monitor it. Brisket can be tough to cook because it takes time. Last week we talked about letting the play develop, right, Joe?
Right.
With brisket, you just got to let the play develop. Some briskets are going to cook fast. Some briskets are going to cook a little bit longer. We're going to try to bring it up to a certain temp, but temperature isn't always the end of the game. Every brisket cooks just a little bit different. So with practice, you're going to make brisket an easy piece of meat to cook. And it'll be fun, enjoyable, probably the most enjoyable piece of meat that we get to cook out here in the backyard. So I've got this brisket I bought from the store, right? What do I do with it next? It's possible that you're going to get a frozen brisket. Those are out there. I don't prefer to have a frozen brisket, but I have used frozen briskets before. Most briskets you're going to find in the supermarket are going to be at refrigerator temperature. Refrigerated, and these things will keep for a week to 2 weeks in the fridge, but I like to use them within a few days. When you buy a brisket, you just want to make sure that it's firm. Joe, I kind of look for marbling throughout. How even is the marbling? This one here seems to be pretty even. A lot of them I'll have a big fat cap, which I've got to trim off a lot. Every animal is different size, so of course you're going to have different sizes of briskets. If you buy a whole brisket and cook this thing up, when you're done you're going to say, where did all my brisket go? Well, there's a lot of fat in this brisket. A good typical rule of thumb is that if you buy a 10-pound brisket, when you're done you're going to have 5 pounds of edible product left at the end of the day. If you're planning on serving folks at a party and you're going to cook brisket, you should plan on somewhere between 1/4 pound to 1/2 pound. 1/3 pound is right there in the middle. It's a good number. If I want to feed 10 people and they're all going to eat 1/3 pound, I need 3 to 4 pounds of finished brisket when I'm done. So I need a 6 or 7 pound brisket to begin with because it's going to shrink about half. Now if I buy a flat brisket, that's going to be a lot leaner. If I'm cooking a flat brisket down, it's not going to shrink near as much. So you might pay a little bit more per pound in the supermarket for a flat brisket than a whole brisket, because a whole brisket's going to shrink a bit more. Flat brisket, you kind of have to watch your P's and Q's a little bit closer. It's a little bit leaner. It's going to be a little bit easier to dry out. It will cook faster, but you kind of have to manage that just a little bit better. Next step of brisket preparation: rubs, brines, injections. What are we cooking for? Are we cooking a competition brisket? Are we cooking a restaurant style brisket? Today we're going to cook a backyard brisket. So if I'm doing a competition brisket, we're going to treat this thing just a little bit different. Check back to our competition brisket video, kind of see how we did that.
That's the Alamosa competition, right?
That was at the Alamosa competition, correct. So with that brisket, we took a lot more time in trimming it. We had some different end goals in mind. We were making burn ends that day. And so if you watch that video, you kind of see how we went through the process of making burn ends and just trimming the brisket a little bit different, making it just so because we were presenting for the judge. In that particular case, we used some injections. What's an injection? How is that different from a brine? An injection is, it could be a brine that you actually inject, but oftentimes it's going to have salt, flavorings, maybe preservatives, who knows what in there, whatever you want to do to impress the judges with that one bite. I don't like to use any injections typically when I'm cooking a brisket. We're just going to make it pretty simple. A brine is a formulation that we make up with salt, basically. Salt and sugar, or just salt, and we'll soak that overnight or for an hour, 2, 3, 4 hours, depending on the purpose and the cut of meat. I don't like to brine any of my brisket. So for a backyard brisket, no brines, no injections. We're just going to simply use a dry rub on the outside. First things first I like to do is bring my brisket to room temperature. A couple things that accomplishes. It's going to take about an hour off of your cook time. Throw a cold brisket on your smoker. It might actually bring the temperature of your smoker down. Go ahead and bring this up to temperature. It's going to make the rub stick just a little bit easier on the outside here. And that's our goal, is to get some rub to stick. While we're letting this brisket warm, we're going to set the fire. So depending on how you want to do it, you're going to prep your fire. Today we're using our Traeger smokers. Traeger's got some good product out here. We're going to use what they call their premium hardwood signature pellet. We set our Traegers at 225. Try to keep your temperature on your smoker or your grill somewhere between 225 and 250. Remember, low and slow is the goal here. There's not necessarily a hard, fast rule of time per pound, but a flat brisket is probably going to take anywhere between 5 to 8 hours. A medium whole brisket like what we got here, I like to smoke for probably 10 to 12 hours. I've cooked large briskets or tougher briskets where I've had to cook those things 14 to up to 18 hours. Depends on the altitude you're at. That might take a little bit longer, but typically where we're at here, I like to smoke my briskets about 14 hours. Anyway, we're going to set the smokers on 225. I like to let those get up to temperature before I throw on my brisket. I like to get a clean smoke rolling, especially if you're using a stick burner. You know, it'll take an hour or so to get a clean smoke rolling. One thing I do, Joe, on my Traegers, I like to manage the humidity inside my smoker. So I will throw in a coffee cup full of water, maybe even add some wood chips in my coffee cup. What that does is just kind of gets the water boiling and allows a little humidity to flow throughout the smoker, keeps the brisket from drying out. A lot of folks will use a spritzer on their meat every hour or so. I don't use a spritzer. I like to get a good bark on the outside, and I just let that humidity roll throughout the smoker. Seems to work pretty well for me. We're going to trim this brisket up. What you guys are going to need is a good trimming knife. This is a great knife here. I love this knife, but it's not a trimming knife. It's too big. It's one I happen to have. I got a couple trimming knives I use. You're going to want to have a big pan to set that in. All right, every brisket's going to be just a little bit different. So we got guys like Trevor that are trimming these briskets every day. You might buy this from a supermarket butcher. Generally, they're going to trim those up pretty nice for you, but there's always a little bit of leftover trim that I kind of like to trim up, take care of. Just keep in mind that we don't want to trim too much fat off, because that's what's going to give us some of that flavor. When this brisket is done and it's cooked down, is there anything on this brisket that I'm on the bottom side of the brisket right now? So on one side of the brisket, you're going to generally find a big piece of fat right here. I like to trim that off a little bit. So we're going to cover this whole thing with a rub. So keep that in mind at the end of the day when we cut this brisket into slices. If we're not going to want to eat this fat, probably half of this is going to render out, but that rub is going to be on the outside of that fat. We want the rub on the portion that we're going to eat. So let's trim this down enough to where we're going to eat everything that's left. So that's why I want to trim a little bit of that off. That way my rub will stick to the remaining fat right here, and that'll render out, or we'll eat it. This particular brisket I find pretty good. The fat cap is pretty even all the way across. We've got about 1 inch here on top. It's going to taper down to, look at that, maybe about 1/4 inch at the backside here. Can you see that, Joe? Mm-hmm. Yep, so we could trim a little bit of this. This is the nose right here. I'll probably trim just a little bit of that off. I don't like to do a lot of trimming. We can trim a little bit of that off though, that way the fat cap is nice and evenly distributed. There's a bit of discussion out there, Joe, whether you're going to cook this brisket fat side up or fat side down. Well, I have my opinion. I don't know if it's right or not, but I like to cook it with the cap side or the fat side up. My idea is that as the fat renders out and it kind of melts, it's going to go down through the meat. I'm going to spread the rub on the bottom side of my brisket first. I'll let that sit for 10 minutes or so, and then I'm going to flip it over and spread the rub on the top side. We have our own homemade brisket rub here. Homemade, I should say, but you can find this, or soon be able to find it online. It's got all the right flavors. So you're going to probably use about 1 cup per brisket. So if you go in your local store and look for your own favorite brisket rub, probably find a 12-ounce bottle or so, and that should be enough for a good sized brisket. This brisket rub has a good mix of salt, pepper, sugar, and a few other spices in there. Anyway, they call it a rub, Joe, because that's what it is. How much rub do I put on? Well,
Enough, right?
just enough. What is enough? Enough is what's going to stick to the meat. If you use a frozen brisket, you're not going to have anything stick to the meat. If you use a cold brisket, you're going to have less stick to the meat. So that's why I like to bring it up to room temperature or nearly room temperature. At least let it sit out for 20 minutes or so. You get the outside of that to room temperature. As you can see, that rub is really sticking to it. Anything that's too much, Joe, is going to roll off when I flip this over. Make sure you coat the outside of the brisket. I'll flip that over for you guys. As you can see, it's all sticking. See that? Flip that over, and then we're going to repeat it. The rub doesn't like to stick to the fat as well, so that's why why we like to bring it up to room temperature. Joe, our brisket is ready to go on the smoker. How's that look?
Looks great.
Yep. So there's lots of ways you can cook a brisket. Today we're cooking on a pellet smoker. You can cook this in an oven. You can cook it in a rotisserie smoker. You can cook it on a stick burner. You can cook it on a Oklahoma Joe charcoal burner. We're going to set this right on the grates in our pellet smoker. I've heard you wrap a brisket, right? When do I wrap it? Well, we're going to go into that in just a little bit. But to get started, we're going to throw this right on our pellet smoker, unwrapped, and we're not going to put it in a pan or anything, just put it right on the grates. What that's going to allow us to do is to allow that smoke to integrate into the meat. That's our goal here with a good smoked brisket. You don't have to smoke a brisket. We might use a different type of rub if we're not going to smoke it. The rub we have here is designed for a smoked brisket. But there are other ways to cook a brisket. We've done it in Dutch ovens. We've cooked it in our kitchen, in our oven in there. And I like to use a little bit different method. We'll do those another day. But today it's all about smoked brisket. Let's go to the smoker, Joe. Got our smoke rolling on the Traeger. It's setting about 175. I'm going to turn that up to 2 1/4. We're going to set that right in the middle here. And then we'll have a coffee cup full of water here. That'll just kind of keep our humidity on the upside in here. It's going to help our brisket from drying out. So the idea here, we're going to smoke this on 225 to about 165 degrees. It's going to be dark 30 by the time we get to that, Joe. You're here all night, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just remember, I'm throwing this on in the middle of the afternoon. It can be a fun project. It can be an all-night project. It can be an early morning project. I plan on 12 hours of cook time. 14 hours by the time you're prepping and unprepping, that kind of thing. So plan on 14 hours if you want to do this thing right. If we're doing a smaller brisket, a flat brisket, you can accomplish that in 6 to 7 hours possibly. So you kind of have to think about all those things when you're planning your party, planning when you're going to eat this brisket. It's not something that happens on a whim. It's a process, but like we're talking here on our channel, Joe, we're talking about slowing food down. That's why this is fun. Brisket is a special cut of meat. It's it's a special time. You want to do this when you have time to enjoy it, time to enjoy cooking. After you're good at it, you can kind of manage around your schedule a little bit if you want to cook brisket ahead of time. I mean, the brisket and leftover barbecue will keep in your fridge for a week. You can munch on that thing for a week. So it's well worth the effort of a weekend barbecue venture.
There's almost kind of a ritual to brisket.
It is a little bit of a ritual, yeah, and kind of sets you in a different time and place when we're cooking a brisket. We're going to come back in about 5 or 6 hours, check the temp, and see if it's where we want to wrap it. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Joe and I have had our fika rest. It was awesome, wasn't it, Joe?
Yeah, it was like a 6-hour fika rest.
Man,
Great.
time flies.
It was practically a night's sleep.
Wow, practically. A little secret this afternoon, I threw a brisket on this morning. Oh my gosh. So anyway, we have one that is ready to wrap. So we're going to take you over to that. This brisket has been on about 7 hours so far, and we've got it up to a temperature of 160. A lot of folks like to wrap their brisket in the middle of a cook. What that does, Joe, is it preserves the bark and it allows the brisket to finish and cook a little bit faster possibly. We've cooked this brisket for about 7 hours on 225 on our Traeger smoker. So during that time, the smoke has integrated the meat. Once we wrap that, we're not probably going to get much smoke into that meat. We still will get, it's still in a smoky environment, so I'm not saying it's not going to get smoke in there, but the wrap is going to help us finish. What are we going to wrap it in? Well, that's another debate for another day. I've wrapped brisket in aluminum foil. Today we're going to wrap it in the all famous pink butcher paper. The reason I like to do it with the pink butcher paper is I feel like that helps preserve the bark just a little bit. When I wrap in foil, it still makes a great product. Don't get me wrong there, but it seems like the bark maybe gets just a little bit mushy. Butcher paper will tend to soak up that fat that's rendering out, but it doesn't go away. It just kind of stays in that environment of the brisket around there in the paper. We'll show you how to do that. Let's go get our brisket, Joe. So what you see I've done here, the trim that I had on this brisket, I threw in another pan. And I'm collecting that here, letting it render out. I'm going to use that in a secret sauce here later. But the brisket we threw on this morning is right here. As you can see, it's shrunk down quite a bit. Almost nearly half.
Was it about the same size?
It's about the same size as the brisket I had this morning. Yeah.
Wow.
It started about a 10 pound. It's probably down to 6 pound. It's going to shrink a little bit more. What we're looking for when our brisket is done is you're going to be able to push on this brisket and your finger's going to actually push into the fat. Right now we still have what we call some bounce in there. So the fat is definitely rendering out, but there's a lot of bounce in the brisket. This brisket is going to require about 6 to 7 more hours. We're going to speed that up just a little bit by wrapping it. But it's got a good bark develop on here, Joe. And I'm sure it's got a good smoke ring inside here. Everything looks good. It looks pretty tasty, but it's not quite finished yet. Now, as far as eating it goes, you could eat this brisket right now if you want to. If you're in a hurry, go ahead and dive in. It's cooked to temp, everything's great with it. It's just going to be a little bit chewy. So to get the most flavor out of this brisket, we want to continue to let the fat render out. Pink butcher paper that I happen to have. Now, I'm not a very good Christmas present wrapper, Joe. I will admit that. Let's lay this out here. So, my wrapping procedure might not be even as good as some of you folks, but I like to lay it here, across that. I'm going to crease these in here. When I'm done wrapping, remember I put the fat side up here, so when I'm done wrapping, I still want the fat side up. Fat side down, fat side up. Down. I'm going to have to finagle that just a little bit, so we get too much paper. It's not the prettiest, but I don't have any gaps in my wrap. I like to make it tight, and y'all might be able to do a better job than I do. But that's going to go back on the smoker now. I'll monitor that for the next few hours, probe it with a temperature probe. What we're looking for on a brisket, Joe, is to at least get it to 195. So if we can get it to 195, depending on what the brisket looks and feels like at that point, we may pull it off at 195 and then let it rest. A lot of folks will take it clear to 205. I'll give you a little tip here. If you take it all the way to 205, it may be overcooked, what some people call overcooked. It's going to break apart really, really nice, probably fall apart, and it's going to be darn tasty, I can tell you that. But it might not make for a good piece of sliced brisket. If you pull that off about 195 and you want to slice it and use it for presentation, that brisket, when you pick up that piece, is going to have a little stretch to it. You'll be able to pick that, if you can imagine the slice of brisket here, you might be able to pick that up, shake it a little bit, it's going to stay together. I like brisket that way, but if you like it a little bit more tender, you can bring it all the way up to 200, 205. Either way, at the end of the cook, you want to make sure you let that thing rest for a little bit, probably at least an hour. When it gets to 200, 205, we're going to take it out, we're going to throw it in a cooler, is a simple way to do it. You're going to keep it wrapped, throw it inside a cooler, let it rest for an hour, then you can pull it back out, put it on your cutting board, and slice it. We'll show you, we'll go into that here just a little bit later, how you slice a brisket. All right, good morning, Joe. By the time you guys have watched this video, I've cooked 3 briskets. We're pretty good, aren't we, Joe? Pretty fast. It's still the afternoon, but however, I have cooked 3 briskets, and I want to show you guys what the finished product looks like. We've got brisket number 1 over here on this trigger. Brisket 2, halfway done, wrapped, finishing out on this one. I cooked a brisket last night, and I've been letting it rest. I have the good fortune of having what we call an electric hot box that I have stored this brisket in for a few hours. I've kept it at a temperature of 165, and I've still kept it wrapped. I haven't even looked at this brisket yet, Joe. So just to keep it honest and real, I don't even know what this baby's going to look like when we pull it out. But what I want to encourage you folks to hear watching the channel today is that brisket can be fun. It doesn't have to be intimidating, and it's going to taste good if you just have patience, take your time doing it, and no matter how it turns out, just have fun with it. Keeping it real, I'm going to unwrap this brisket, which we've been letting rest for several hours. Normally, like I mentioned here just a little bit ago, when your brisket gets to 195 to say 202, we're going to pull that thing out. We're going to put it inside of a cooler in a pan, wrapped, and we're going to let that thing rest for at least an hour. That cooler is going to act just like a hot box, and your brisket is going to stay warm in there, but the temperature is going to come down. It lets that fat kind of come back into the meat, lets the meat rest. It'll just make a better tasting and a better slicing product. Here we go. It's about to get real. Here we go.
Man, I can smell it.
Yes, you can. There is our finished product right there. So, Joe, this was also a whole brisket, so it still has the point on. I talked a little bit on that other brisket about the firmness or the bounce in the brisket. You can see here we've got a little bit more squish to this fat that's still in here. It's rendered out. You can see that how it's still, the fat's got some texture, but see how it's a little bit juicier there. We don't have quite so much. We got a little bit of fat here, but see how it pushes in, and I can actually poke my finger into that fat. So that's what we're looking for. This section down here doesn't have near as much fat. This is the flat part. I cooked this brisket a little bit longer than I wanted to last night. I brought it all the way to 205. In my book, that's just a little bit overdone. I didn't want to bring it quite that far, but we're going to go ahead and slice it here and see what it looks like.
So how do you slice a brisket like this? Like, where would you start?
You bet. Let's have a quick look at that. So there it is. Okay, so this is the flat part. The grains on the flat part of the brisket are going to run this way, Joe, and then up here on the nose, they're going to run this way. We like to cut across the grain. So I usually start my knife about right here, and we're going to trim the flat part all the way up to here. We can continue all the way through, but I'm going to trim this off today just so you get an idea what the nose looks like. There we go. This has got a little pull to it. It actually stays together. See how that is? It's not too bad, but it wants to come apart. It's about right. It's just a little bit more than ideal, but that's just to show you that you got a little bit room for error. It's not the end of the world. It's still going to have a great taste to it. Lay that out on a platter. Throw that on a sandwich. The flat part is what it's called is flat for a reason. If I take my knife and slide right under here, I'm going to pull this up. What I'm doing is cutting underneath the fat cap. As you can see here, you can kind of see this particular muscle. See how the grains are going a different direction, right? They're going that direction. This is part of that fat cap. You can see how it naturally just wants to break apart right there. So your knife's going to naturally flow underneath there. I'm going to come back. There's the nose or the fat cap, right? So you may find, if you're in a supermarket, you may find this piece, which is called the brisket flat. If you do, that's fine. And just be aware that it doesn't have this nice big chunk of fat on there. This isn't all fat, but it's going to cook a lot faster. And you got to manage that just a little bit more because it might dry out a little bit faster. And then if you want to make some burn ends, you can trim this any way you like. But what we're going to do here is we're going to turn that the other direction, Joe, and we'll slice it across here. So now we're going across the grain, right? This one's going to have a bit more fat to it. Yep. You can cut those in 1-inch chunks, cubes. You can slice it. If you want to make some awesome burn ends, you can lay those out here like this. We'll show that in another video, but there's the beginning of some good burn ends right there.
Just like the root beer ones did at the Alamosa competition.
Yeah, those were awesome. So there you go. At our restaurant, Joe, we had a famous Wyatt Earp, which is basically just a chopped brisket sandwich. We just cut that in about a 1-inch slice, like so. I don't like to use this knife for that purpose, but that brisket is so tender, we'll just chop that up. Good barbecue sandwich, we'll just blend all that together. If you're into sauce, which I know a good place where you can get some sauce, www.diosmokehouse.com, www.diosmokehouse.com. Awesome barbecue sauces, but use your favorite barbecue sauce on that. There's a good pile of chopped brisket meat. Throw that on a bun. Awesome. So Joe, Brisket Basics today. I think we about covered it all. But just to remind you guys, I don't want brisket to be intimidating. It should be fun, enjoyable. A few keys here to keep in mind. Number 1, stay calm and brisket on, right? You got to stay calm. We got a big game ahead of us, just like we talked last week in our tailgating video. Don't get nervous. Let's just stay calm. Let's have fun. Remember, the goal of the game is to have fun, right? How do we have fun? Stay calm. We got to prep. If you've done all the prep, you just kind of let everything else take its course. What's involved in preparation? Well, choosing a good rub. We've got those to offer. You probably have a favorite rub at your favorite meat store. And I've kind of showed you guys the basics of choosing a brisket. So make a good choice with your brisket, a good choice with your rub. What else is preparation? Temperature. Remember, on your fire, 225. Low and slow is the key to a good brisket. Low and slow. Don't try to do this too fast. You've got your rub done, you've got your temperature done, you've got a great brisket. You're having fun. Let your play develop. Have patience. Don't get in a hurry with brisket. Number 5, monitor. There's always halftime, right, Joe? We monitor what we're doing. Hey, we might need to make some adjustments. Hey, is my fire staying hot? Is my smoker staying at 225? After you've wrapped, everything's monitored. Everything's just like what we're talking about here. We got to finish. Let's not forget to finish. Patience, perseverance, right? God's called us to the race. We got to persevere. Same here when we're in our outback yard cooking brisket. We just got to have patience, persevere. Sit down, enjoy your company, have a drink, have another one, enjoy your company, talk to Joe, hang out, have a good time. It's what we're all about right here. Slow stuff down, right? Slow life down a little bit. So finish the job. Number 7, enjoy your work. These are the keys here. Just have fun with it. That's the main thing. Don't be intimidated. You've got all the keys right here to make a brisket. Give yourself a little room. It's not an exact science. If it doesn't quite turn out quite perfect, it's still going to taste good. I promise you. Our goal here is to make it less intimidating to cook a brisket. So I hope you all enjoyed watching what we had for you today. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.